A qualitative interview is not a medical interview. It's also not a conversation where you can just go randomly off wherever the interest takes you on a tangent. And it's also not just a list of questions that you're going through and asking, because if it was, you could just send somebody a questionnaire and they could fill that in. So, qualitative interviewing requires a specific set of skills that allow you to develop a deep understanding of somebody else's experience from their perspective. And you need to develop this without judgment, without trying to see where you can give them advice or change something or even interpret it other than what you're being told. As you prepare for your qualitative interview, don't be the captain of the Titanic. It's said that the undoing of the Titanic was the captain's vast years of experience and expertise. He'd sailed hundreds of ships before, and he was confident he could navigate the icebergs at high speed. But he'd never sailed a ship quite like the Titanic before, and he miscalculated how quickly he could turn it in the icy waters. Experience can be your worst enemy. You may be experienced at medical interviews or experienced at conversation, but qualitative interviewing is a different vessel entirely. Try and understand the nature of the ship you're about to sail. That's what this talk is going to give you. It's an introduction to qualitative interviewing with some key pointers that will help you steer your ship in the right direction. We're not going to cover the logistics like consents or ethical considerations or making sure you have the right equipment and processes in place. All of those things are important, but they're outside the scope of this talk. My name is Mindy Silva, and I have just recently finished my PhD, which centered around qualitative interviews with parents of children with cerebral palsy. And what we're going to cover today is the value of using a semi structured interview, how to design your semi structured interview well with good questions that keep your ship afloat, and good techniques to give you a smooth sail all the way to your destination. So that instead of being the kind of interviewer who is unaware of the bad habits that you have developed over the years of doing good medical interviews, or somebody who's unsure where to start, which questions to ask, how do you know if you've got enough of the right kind of data, you can be the kind of person who knows how to develop your focus interview guide that gives you clarity around the purpose of the questions that you're asking and has the right probes and transition questions to really get you an interesting and informative interview and keep your participants eager and willing to give you in-depth answers that give you the kind of data you need for your research. The information that I'm sharing with you today comes mostly from a really excellent book on qualitative research called Qualitative Research and Evaluation Methods by Michael Quinn Patton. It's the book that I found the most helpful in designing my own semi-structured interview guides, because a lot of the information that I found out there really centered around advising interviewers to be good listeners, pay attention, be interested in what the speaker has to say. Well, that's not helpful. It's like telling somebody who's drowning to keep their head up and swim. Of course, they know that's what they have to do, but they don't know how to do it. If they could do that, then they wouldn't be drowning in the first place, right? Other advice is just wrong. For example, the advice is that you look somebody in the eye so that you're showing you're paying attention. Well, that's just creepy. And it directs your attention inwards towards your body so that instead of focusing on being involved in the interview, you're focused on what you look like and what your body's doing. And then when the participant stops speaking, you've suddenly got to like look down your list to ask the next question because you haven't been engaged in the conversation or kind of immersed in it. And you can't force yourself to be interested. You're either interested or you're not interested. So if somebody's drowning and you say, well, stop drowning, just swim, that doesn't really help. You have to give them specific actions. You might say to them, I'm going to throw you a buoy and you're going to grab onto it and that's going to keep you safe. It's specific actions that you're giving them to do. And your buoy in qualitative interviewing is your clear intent around the reason you're asking that question in the first place. So your clear intent will automatically set you up to be listening to see if the participant is answering that question that you've asked them. And attention and natural immersion in the interview will then just be a byproduct. You don't have to have this kind of weird forced eye gaze thing going on. So by clear intent, I don't mean that you're waiting for the participant to answer the big question of your project. It means that you're asking a question because you want to understand a specific part of that person's experience from a specific perspective. So, for example, you might be looking at it from a behavior perspective, and your question might be around, if I was a fly on the wall, what would I see? Or you might be asking it from a value perspective. So, what do they believe or think about a situation? What sort of opinion do they have on it? From a feeling perspective, what are their emotions around it? Are they happy, sad, afraid, excited? Or a knowledge perspective, what do they know about this? Or an experiential perspective of sensory, what did they see, hear, smell, and so on. Right. So I'll give you a funny story that comes straight from Peyton's book. In this story, a man had fallen onto the railway tracks and people were trying to save him. They were shouting at him to try and help him to get out. Give us your hands, they shouted, give us your hands. But the man just stood there. He wouldn't give his hands up at all. Then another man called Nasruddin pushed through the crowd to see what was going on. And when he saw the man on the railway track, he asked him, what is your profession? I'm a taxman, shouted the man on the railway tracks. To which Nasruddin responded, here, take my hand. The man took his hand and was pulled to safety. And then Nasruddin turned to the amazed bystanders and said, never ask a taxman to give you anything, you fools. I'm not very good at telling jokes, but that is a good story because it's about asking the right question in the right way to get the right response. And that's key. So you know already that you shouldn't be asking questions that you can answer with a yes, no, but you should also know that you shouldn't be asking questions that you could respond with a like it scale. So, how satisfied were you with the service? It's better than a yes, no question because you can't answer it as yes, no, but you could answer it with very satisfied or a little satisfied or not satisfied. So there's your like it scale. That's not giving you depth at all to your questions. Go back to the intent of your questions. Did you want to see something or did you want to understand something about the behavior that the person had as part of their experience? So you might ask, if I had come with you to appointment, what would I have seen you doing that was easy for you to do? Or if I'd come with you to the appointment, what would I have seen you doing that was difficult for you to do? Now, don't combine these two. Don't say, if I'd come with you to the appointment, what would have been easy or difficult for you? That's fine in a conversation, but in a qualitative interview, you want to have each of those two things separate because each of them will give you different data. This is a qualitative interview, not a conversation, and you want that depth. And if you just ask both the positive and the negative in the same sentence, or your questions run into each other like that, the participant will pick the most salient one, or the one they heard last, or the one that's easiest to speak about. And so you want to give each one its own space. If you're interested in, say, the value of the experience for the participant, you might ask, for example, what about the service was most valuable? Or feelings, how did you feel about the service you received? Or knowledge, what do you believe is the purpose of the service? Or experiential or sensory, when you came into the room and you spoke to the secretary, what did she say to you when you arrived? What did you see in the room? What were your first impressions? By being really clear about what it is you're trying to understand about the experience, you're listening for what the person says to you because they might say something. You might ask a feeling question. How did you feel about the service? And then they say, well, I don't think it's a good idea to have 3 secretaries at the desk. Well, that's opinion. It's not a feeling. So then you might have to stick in a probing question to understand how that made them feel about the fact that there were 3 secretaries at the desk, rather than to ask them why they thought it was a good idea or a bad idea, which is an opinion. Probes are a really good way to get clarity around the intent of your question. Probing is just one of the techniques that you might use to make sure that your interview goes from feeling like you're drawing teeth on a first date to feeling like you're having an easy conversation with an old friend. So probes are one of the tools. Some other tools you might use is illustration questions, role play questions, looking for markers in the interview, or transitions and reinforcers as part of your interview. And I'm going to look at each of these briefly with you. So probes are ideas that you put under your main question that help you to clarify or contrast an answer that somebody's already given you about your main question. A probe is something you may or may not ask depending on the person's response. So for example, you said the program was a success. What did you mean by success? Is a good sort of clarification question. Well, can you say more about that? Is the great probe. How does the success of X program compare with the success of Y program is a nice contrasting question that will give you a more in-depth answer. Markers are things that the participant says to you whilst they're giving you the answer that you notice as something that's worth following down a train of thought. So, for example, I was speaking to a parent about sleep, and they mentioned how epilepsy medication impacted that sleep. Now, epilepsy was not part of my questions, but we went down that route anyway and got really valuable information. When you pick up on these markers that participants drop into the conversation, your participant feels heard. So it really helps to build rapport, and it also taps into things that are on top of their mind, which makes it easy for them to speak more in depth about. And that's why it's called a semi-structured interview, right? You have the license to go off script away from your question list. But at the same time, you have your question guidelines that give you a clear intent about what it is you want to get out of this questionnaire. And so you can come back to it in a good way. Another tool is illustrative examples. This is a great way to help participants feel comfortable being honest with you about what they're thinking or feeling. And it's acceptable in qualitative interviewing to refer to what other people have said or shared, which may not be as acceptable in a medical type interview. So there's another contrast and difference. So saying something like, some of the people I've interviewed have told me that they absolutely love the service, and others have told me that it was terrible. How have you experienced the service for yourself? It lets the speaker know that you've already heard it all, that you're not going to be shocked or upset either way by what they say. And so it opens up the space for them to be honest with you. Role playing is another lovely technique that you can use. And with role playing, you get a chance to be a little bit creative. People tend to be able to talk often more freely, or think more with a different lens when they're thinking about how somebody else might respond to a situation than if you ask them directly about themselves. So, for example, in my study, I asked parents what a good therapy home program was, and they really struggled to conceptualize that. But then I asked them to imagine a family who were really doing well with their therapy home program and to describe what they were doing, that other family, that imaginary family, what they were doing. And it became much easier for them to really conceptualize or pull out parts of what the other family, the imaginary family, was doing in the role play position, to give me that data and information about what they actually felt or thought was a good therapy home program. So a question like, if your friend was just starting to use the service, what would you tell them to do to get the best out of it? That's a bit of a role play within your question. So those are types of questions you might ask. And then as you're going through your interview guide, you'll be switching from maybe one topic to another. And this is a good place to use transitions. They're another tool that really helps get you the data that you want, and it keeps the conversation flowing. It helps to maintain rapport, and it helps to orientate your participant about what's coming so they can kind of have thoughts ready to go as you ask them the question. So different types of transitions are contextualizing, summarizing, and feedback. So a contextualizing question might be saying something like, this next question is a little odd, or this next question is a little difficult, so that they're prepared for that. Or a summarizing question might be something like, we've been talking about this, and now we're going to be moving on to this, but this is what I've understood so far. Is there anything else you want to add before we move on to talking about this next topic? So you're summarizing what's come before and prepping them for what's coming next. And then feedback might be something that you say, your comments have been really helpful for this and this and this. And the next thing we're going to focus on is this and this. So it really gives feedback to the participant that the way they're answering the questions is what you're looking for, and gives them confidence to speak freely with you. Okay. So lastly, you want to make sure you've got a solid ending question so that any final thoughts are captured. In qualitative interviews, and I think in many interviews, this is where the gold drops in. So make sure you record up until the very last minute, because you turn off the recorder and the person relaxes, and then they tell you all the good stuff that you now don't have on tape. So don't hit stop recording until you've got everything down. Okay. Final question suggested by Peyton in his book, he kind of gave three. Something like, what should I have asked you that I didn't think to ask, is a good one. What is the most important thing you think I should pay attention to when I review your transcript later? Or just simply asking if there's anything else you want to add. The nice thing about qualitative interviewing is that if there's things that you've missed and your participant points it out to you, you can carry those questions through into the next participant's questionnaire because you don't have to get the same data from each participant. Your semi-structured interview guide consists of your main questions, some well thought out transitions, and a good ending question with prompts under each of the main questions that direct your attention to the main intent of what you want to get out of that question. And really, I want to encourage you to embrace the flexibility of qualitative research, to add or change your questions between participants. Quantitative interviewing is not the same as quantitative research, and it can feel a little bit weird, but the the data that you want out of a qualitative interview needs to be rich and deep, not conforming to something that you can do statistical analysis around. So your interview guide should be short enough to allow for deep conversation and following the markers that your participant drops, and not an onerous list of interrogative questions. And it's okay to have some silence in the interview. Be okay with just sitting there and giving your participant time to think and answer your questions thoughtfully. And also be okay with asking really simple questions, because simple or silly questions help everybody relax and get the participants speaking more freely. You're not the authoritative figure in this exchange, you're the curious onlooker. And although it can feel pretty weird and even difficult to not be listening in order to see where you need to come in with your solution, where you need to change something, um, you might need to actually even just bite your tongue or take deep breaths so that you step outside of your usual role. But it's really worth doing it. It will change the way you think. And more importantly, it will change the way you listen and connect and understand. It's a little addictive, actually. You are in for a really transformative journey, and I hope you make the most of it.